Hi and welcome to my channel. So today we're going to start reading a book called The Darkangel by Meredith and Pierce. It's the first book in a trilogy and it's one of my favourite books of all time. I first read this book when I was 8 years old and I'm 42 now. So I hope that you're all going to like this book as much as I did and we'll have a lot of fun while we're reading it. Let's start. The Darkangel by Meredith and Pierce. Chapter 1. The Steeps of Terrain. Iriel rested the broad basket against her hip and adjusted her kirtle. The steep climb she and her companion had been taking the last 600 paces or so had caused the loose flowing garment to twist around at the neck and fall askew. "I have to rest," she said faintly, and not waiting for her companion's reply, she sank down on the hard, grey, brittle rock of the mountainside and set her empty basket down beside her. It was cold up in the steeps. The air was too thin to hold any heat, but Solstar was warm. A bare 6 hours from setting, its white light streamed back at her from the eastern horizon, warm on her bare arms and neck and face, warming the broken rock shelf on which she sat. Iriel gazed out over the wide plain of Averick. Fair as a pearl, bright as foxfire beneath the black starry heavens, Oceanus hung, a swirl of blue and white almost directly ahead of her. Below she could see her village over to the right, tiny and far away, at the foot of the mountain on the edge of the plain. "Come on," said Edwin, digging her toe into Iriel's backside. "We've still a way to go yet." Iriel sighed and got up, followed her companion. Edwin was tall and slender, as befitted a person of lineage. After all, she was the daughter of the village syndic, and her mother was the half-sister of the satrap. She had a carriage about her, Iriel observed wistfully, all self-sure, completely arrogance that came with living the life in the largest house in the village with 16 different kirtles. Think of it, 16! Iriel had just 2, and house servants. Iriel was one of these. She gazed longingly at her well-born mistress's hair, black as the heavens with a blue sheen by earthlight. Edwin's skin, pale and blue as breast milk, had a subtle radiance that gleamed even in shadow, but Iriel, slighter than her companion by a head, was boy-shaped still. Her skin was deeper shaded, a wan rose tan that even bleaching with lightning weed could not expunge, and her hair, thinner and finer than Edwin's was. It was silvery yellow, pretty enough by daylight or lamplight, but it took on a hideous greenish cast like unripe figs by earthshine. Iriel sighed, and she scrambled up the slope after Edwin, admiring the other's long-limbed stride, envying but hopelessly the unconscious ease with which the syndic's daughter held her basket slung over her back like a cloak. Iriel knew that even when she herself began blooming into maidenhood, as Edwin was blooming now, even then she could not hope to match her mistress's proud grace. After another 100 paces, Iriel said, "We're getting awfully high." Without turning around, her companion answered, "The summit's not much further." "I can't see the village any more," said Iriel. It was true. The turn they had just taken had led them around the mountain face a few degrees. Edwin laughed. "What are you afraid of?" she asked, her sapphire eyes now mocking merry. "Darkangels." She stopped a moment to let Iriel come up beside her. "You really do believe the old cradle-tail bomber was telling us," said Edwin, "don't you?" Iriel thought back on the strange, half-silly, half-deliciously exciting stories the bumbling old wife sometimes spun for her young charges at the distaff. She had told them one only a few hours before Iriel and Edwin had set out from the village to gather wedding flowers on the steeps. By way of a caution, Iriel supposed, though this one had come out more muddled, and therefore ludicrous than sobering. Edwin dropped her basket to the ground. Iriel watched as she hunched her shoulders and screwed up her face in imitation of the old nurse's features. "The wraiths!" she whispered, as if toothless. "The wraiths that roam the mountains, snatching bodies, causing landslides. Believe me!" She wagged one claw finger at Iriel. "Believe me, girl, I've seen them. Don't you get up on those high steeps or you'll regret it, if you live to regret it." Iriel bit her lip to suppress a smile. Edwin always reduced her to helpless mirth. "And the vampires!" Edwin railed. The Ikari! Dozens of black wings and the faces of demons! One look and they'll turn you to stone, and then where you'll run, girl. The syndic's daughter began to stagger, worry in her hands and muttering. One'll swoop you away to his castle and make you his bride. And you know what the Ikari does with their brides, do you, girl? Her voice had thinned from a low whisper to a faint hysterical shriek. Iriel wrapped her arms around her ribs and fought to hold back laughter. They drinks their souls! Edwin shrilled, and then she shrank to her knees, grasping. Oh, my heart, my poor heart! Exactly as Iriel had seen her half-senile old nurse doing numerous times. Iriel gave up. She laughed until she felt breathless and giddy. Though the air on the high steeps was too thin for laughing properly or long, she felt a little sick with the altitude and had to sit down again, rest her forehead on her knees. Sobering now, she kept her face hidden. She did not want Edwin moving on before she could regain her breath. Unsmiling now, Iriel thought about Bomba's stories and shook her head. No, it was not the tales of Bomba that had worried her, fat, good-natured Bomba, but Derna's, gaunt, furtive Derna, who used to sit at the loom in the workroom a little distance from the others, staring off at nothing, her spare, withered fingers weaving by touch. Her tales were of a different sort from Bomba's. Derna whispered of Dracs and witches, gargoyles and spectres, horrifying tales of death and drowning. Edwin always laughed at them as she did at Bomba's simple-minded fables, but they made Iriel shudder. Derna never got muddled in her tellings. She spoke as if she knew. Iriel raised her head from her knees. Edwin had risen and shaken off her guise. Pulling a few black strands of hair from her large clear blue eyes, she kicked her basket deftly downhill towards Iriel, then nodded for her bondservant to follow her, as she strode gracefully up the path. Iriel sighed again shortly, collecting her mistress's basket along with her own, wished she had a servant to carry for her whenever she grew tired of carrying. Cheer up, Worry Wrinkle, Edwin cried over one shoulder. What vampire would want you? Iriel shook the frown from her face. No, it's just that, she began, staring after her companion and tripping. Balancing on the steep slope while clutching a basket in each hand was proving difficult. She scrambled to her feet, snatched up Edwin's basket before it could roll away down the slope like tumblebush, and hurried up alongside her mistress again. It's just that the sun will be down in a few hours and... 6! cried Edwin, laughing. We've plenty of time before nightshade. Yes, but what if... Iriel almost lost her footing again on the smooth, crumbling rock, and Edwin pulled her to her feet without so much as a glance or a pause in stride. Iriel held to the baskets. But what if one of us gets hurt, she continued, or loses the way? Do you mean what if you get hurt? Asked Edwin without rancour. After all, you seem to be the only one stumbling. She laughed and did not offer to help carry. But by the Pendulon, if I'd have known you'd be so clumsy, I might have allowed more time. Iriel blushed and looked away. It was true. She was clumsy, and beside her mistress's deft grace, she always felt doubly so. Her companion tilted one shoulder in a shrug and glanced at Iriel. Don't fear, little lameling. If you should twist an ankle or knock yourself silly falling off a ledge, I'll carry you and the baskets back in less time than it's taken us to get this far. Iriel felt her colour deepen. She bit her lip against the retort. She wasn't lame, just awkward and unsure. Edwin knew that. Iriel's knuckles on the basket whitened. She glanced at Edwin. The syndic's daughter smiled at her carelessly. Iriel's eyes stung. These were the only times she ever resented Edwin, who used that hated name, Lameling. She realised only to bait her. This time, though, she seemingly meant no teasing by it. Perhaps she even intended it affectionately. Iriel relaxed her hands and let her colour fade. You needn't worry about the other either, her companion was saying. Her tone was one of friendly tolerance. I won't lose the way, and if you keep by me, you won't either. Iriel sighed and shoved her thoughts away. She fell into step behind Edwin again. The sun fell warm on Iriel's back, and the shadows, whenever the path ducked behind boulder or ledge, were cold as well water. She dropped one basket from her hip as the trail grew narrower. She let the light, bulky mesh of the twined marsh grass bump against her leg, and they climbed. She fell to watching the landscape, the lie of the rocks. She listened to the bell-thorn's silvery thin briars that tinkled like glass on the rare mountain wind. She watched the small rose-coloured lizards sunning themselves in the last hours of Solstar before crawling into their crags again to sleep for another long nightshade. She looked at the petrified bones in the rocks, bones of fishes, eels, and water plants left over from the time when the steeps had been nothing but flat mud bottom and the world was all a sea. "Here are some now," said Edwin, halting abruptly. Ariel almost ran into her. Ariel eyed the low-spread, blossoming shrub at their feet. Edwin gazed forward and gestured ahead. "And there are more up the slope." They were near the pinnacle of the mountain. Ariel could scarcely feel herself breathe. The sky was blacker here. The sun was whiter, the earth bluer, the stars brighter. When Ariel looked down, she could see the light, luminous haze of atmosphere lying on the footholds in the plain. "You pick these," Ariel was telling her, taking her own basket back, "and I'll get the ones further up." It was difficult for Ariel to hear her. The air was so thin. She obviously was shouting, but Ariel, only a pace away, had trouble making out the more faintly spoken words. She nodded her reply. "You brought a flask, didn't you?" demanded Edwin, taking hold of the empty one she herself wore on a thong hung from her neck. It was a simple water skin for desert travel, a couple of handspans long, made of white kid with an ivory stopper and beads of tinted bone. Ariel nodded and tapped her own smaller, undecorated flask hanging from her neck. "Good then," cried Edwin softly, as if from a great distance. "Stay here in sight. Don't wander, and don't spill any." Ariel nodded. Edwin swung her basket over one shoulder and went up on the last, steepest 20 paces to the top. Ariel watched her easy, sure-footed ascent, her mistress's free hand resting lightly on the rock or boulder from time to time to help her balance. Ariel wished that she could have been born so long-limbed and self-sure, so beautiful. She sat her basket down and knelt beside the horn scrub and began gathering the flowers. These horn flowers grew on a tiny grey-silver bush, which lived only on the highest steeps where the air was rare and perilously thin. Not the slightest breeze ever stirred to disturb them. Each branch of the bush was covered with tiny trumpet-shaped flowers, yellowish-white, translucent as frost. Each trump was filled with a tiny drop of pale golden liqueur, sweeter than ginger and richer than rum. Ariel pulled one blossom ever so gently from its twig. The trick was to gather them one by one, painstakingly, so that not a drop would be spilled in either the picking or the pouring from flower to wineskin. The task was made doubly difficult by the flocks of tiny humming swifts, no bigger than fireflies, that swarmed about the flowers and the lip of the wineskin, and could, between 3 or 4 of them, drink a horn dry before Ariel could get the flower from bush to bottle. She shooed at them with one hand, while keeping the other holding the flower perfectly steady. Ariel dropped the first emptied trump into the mesh basket beside her and reached slowly for another bloom, and then another and another. The motions became mechanical. Her back began to ache and her legs felt stiff, but Ariel ignored the pains, waved away the bothersome bee-birds, and carried on gathering. A marriage was to take place in the village at sundown, dusk being the customary and proper time for weddings in Averick. Edwin, as the eldest cousin to the bride, was pledged to bring the bridal cup of hornbloom nectar and garlands of the wedding's trumps, but these could be harvested only in the few hours before the marriage, the precious liquor and delicate blossoms so quickly spoiled. It seemed to Ariel as she poured the contents of another pale trumpet-shaped flower into the goat-hide bottle, the humming of the tiny swifts had grown rather louder and shrill. She tossed the empty flower into the basket and ignored the sound to concentrate on carefully plucking another blossom. She imagined the preparations in the village, the decking of the streets with banners of white gauze, the bathing of the bride. It occurred to Ariel then that the sound she was hearing was not the angry whine of humming swifts, but something else. A voice. "Edwin is calling me," she thought as she pulled a flower away from the stalk. The pitch of the voice changed abruptly, intensified. Ariel brought the hornbloom to the rim of the bottle. No, not calling any more, she realized suddenly. Screaming. Ariel dropped the flowers. She felt its droplets spill hot as a tear. No, hotter. Hot as tallow. It burned her hand. She looked up the slope to where Edwin was. The basket of wedding trumps laid overturned at Edwin's feet. Her young mistress was standing mute now, looking up at the sky. Then Iriel saw wings very near, great wings descending, a creature with more wings than she could count, all black, all beating fiercely. She felt a faint breeze against her cheek. For all the fury of those terrible wings, the air was too thin to carry more than a feeble gust. They were jet, those wings, as deep as the sky, as black as Edwin's hair, no blacker, for they were dull, unoiled. They gave off no sheen in the light and no gleam to the eye. They drank up the light and diminished it. They were wings of pure shadow. It seemed to Iriel as she watched that storm of darkness descend, that she discerned the figure of the man at its heart. A man dressed in a pale garment, a man of fair complexion, but the wings beat with such rapidity against the near-emptied air that she could not make out his face. The figure barely reached the mountain top and alighted. His sandalled feet had hardly touched the stone. Before him, Edwin cried in terror. Though Iriel knelt not 20 paces from her, the sound was distant. It felt as though it travelled miles. He held out his arms to Edwin abruptly as in command. Edwin backed away. The Darkangel stepped towards her. Iriel could only see the vague white shimmer of his garment amid the dark fury of the still beating wings. Edwin whirled and began to run down the slope to Iriel. She had not taken 2 steps before the vampire had swooped and caught her. Iriel heard Edwin's piercing cry. The Icarus' speed and Edwin's weight bore them forward and down. His powerful wings thrashed the air. Iriel bolted to her feet too fast. Her legs, still from long sitting, would not bear her. The vampire swooped overhead so close that Iriel could have reached to touch him. The world had reeled, and falling she threw up her arms, then not to touch but to ward off the cold, fleeting shadow of those horrible wings. Her knees buckled. She felt her feet skid from under her. The Darkangel was gaining altitude above her. She saw Edwin still struggling in his arms, but could no longer hear the screams. Iriel felt her elbow strike the earth, and then her shoulder as a dozen sharp, hard-rolling pebbles dug into her flesh. The ground was in motion beneath her, slipping, sliding. The Icarus was already far away, a dark blot against the stars. She glimpsed the shadow of his dozen wings, very small against Oceanus. "Edwin! Edwin!" She started to cry, and then her head struck ground with a sickening jolt. The back of her skull went numb, and all the sky was white stars for a moment. Her scalp felt wet and warm. Then suddenly the brightness dimmed. "Edwin!" She held herself breathe, barely once, just before all the light in the world went out. Iriel licked her lips and burned her tongue on the sweetness of horn liquor. She was lying on hard sloped ground. Jagged pebbles pressed into her back like a great pusspox, hurting her. She could feel the goatskin bottle on her chest and the warmth on her cheek and throat where it had splashed out, spilling. She was lying on the slope, her head lowest, her feet uphill from her. Her toes were numb, and all this she knew without opening her eyes. She opened them slowly and saw the star-littered sky above, through the slight glare of the sun in her eyes. She tried to move and found it very hard, very hard. Her head came away sticky from the ground, with a soreness that made her feel sick and stupid. She got one elbow up under her and propped herself up. She gazed straight at Oceanus, a huge and constant blue with no shadow of wings across it now. She said, "Edwin," and she wept. But she was too weak to weep much. Her hand was cold. All her body was warm in the sun, but her left hand was cold. She looked at it presently and saw that the shadow of a boulder down the slope had crept across it. That frightened her. She snatched it up from the shadow and sat up, twisted around too quickly. Her temples pounded. She felt the blood running out of her head, and the blotches of darkness wandered across the stars. Solstar was setting. She could see it as her vision cleared. It was barely 3 degrees above the horizon, and that would diminish as she descended into the mountain. She twisted her head around the other way. The pain increased sharply at the sudden move. She could already see the shade of night across the desert to the west. She had 2 hours, maybe less, to get back to the village by nightfall. With the wedding procession about to begin, who would miss one little slave? She chafed the leaden, cold-bitten hand in her lap and felt nothing. It was numb. She groped for the flask at her neck. Yes, there was a little of the liquor left. She poured the bright liquid onto her limp, waxy hand, and then grimaced, rocked in pain as the heat soaked through the frostbite, burned to the bone and then to the marrow. As the heat diminished and was gone, the colour returned to her hand and she could move it. She got to her knees and then fell to her feet. She took a step, tumbled and fell again. She got up and started down the slope. The soreness in her head was mostly dull, but when she missed her footing and staggered, the pain stabbed. She clung to the rocks of the mountainside, to the scrub weed, to the crannies. She raked her arm on the bellthorn and scraped her knuckles raw when she slipped. Twice the winding trail crumbled beneath her feet and fell away down the mountainside like a tiny meteor shower. And always the sun sank lower as she descended the steep, and the shadows lengthened, the air grew warmer and thicker, and her breathing eased. Solstar had halfway sunk into the sea of dust by the time she had heard the marriage hymns drifting up into the foothills, into the soft plains. Strange. It seemed strange after the airless, muted steeps that here below, still a quarter-mile from the village, she could hear the singing so distinctly so far away. She listened to the words floating in the long, harsh twilight. Fara atwai, naret mira omni hadu. Here in the foothills, just coming into the village, the path was much broader, smoother, less steep. She had come this way a dozen times, up to the spring to catch the minnows, up to play in the caves and gather mushrooms, and just 6 hours passed up to the mountains with Edwin. Iriel grimaced with the pain of remembering Edwin. Edwin had once pulled her out of one of those dark pools when she slipped, pulled her out by her hair and pounded her on the back as she knelt, wet and shuddering, on the slick, steep bank, until Iriel had coughed up a half measure of bitter water and no more would come. That had been 2 years ago. Iriel's head hurt now, as she fled down the broad, smooth path by the caves towards the village. She did not want to think of Edwin. She thought of the music instead. Theros idil temkin teral, mahom bitembil feral. The words were closer now, a little louder. She realized she was in the village. The smooth, square, whitewashed adobe houses gleamed in the dying light of Solstar. Gathered gauze dipped and draped softly from their dark windows. The great street that ran east-west was a long corridor of light, and the little north-south side streets were dark as death. Antwin, Dantwin, Teanjul Hem, Letchkul, Mimichkul, Gamberg, and Rend. She was passing the houses more quickly now. She could see the village square ahead, filled with people. Then suddenly she was among the people, who did not seem to notice her, but went on with the singing. Their eyes turned towards the half-gone sun. Pushing past them, she gave a cry to make them stop. The hymn broke off raggedly in mid-verse. The syndic frowned from his place before the bride and groom. The bride in her new woven sari glanced around. Behind her and the syndic, Iriel saw Edwin's mother, a thin-faced aristocrat with hair like night. Old Bomba swayed beside her, nodding off into sleep even as she stood. Iriel stared at Bomba and the mother. "Edwin!" she gasped, breathless. The syndic, Edwin's father, had been standing in the shadow and came forward now into the glare. "Yes," he said. "Where is she?" "The ceremony cannot be completed without the bridal cup." He eyed the flask still hanging from Iriel's neck. "Has she sent you ahead with it?" "She—" Iriel could not catch her breath. "No, she—" "Well, where is she then?" demanded the syndic, pursing his fine lips. He gave an exasperated sigh. "How that girl can dawdle!" Turning back to Iriel, his patience thinned. "Come out with it, drudge, or I'll have you beaten." "Gone!" cried Iriel, marvelling that even yet he did not understand. The Icarus," she faltered. "The one with the wings." The syndic shook his head impatiently. "Are you gaming with me, drudge? Now where's my daughter, your mistress? Where's Edwin?" Iriel gazed at him and longed to faint. The syndic glared at her and would not listen. The townspeople all stood now, hushed, staring. Her head felt light and ached. She felt her balance tip. She swayed and staggered. The syndic eyed her with sudden suspicion. "Have you been tasting those hornflowers, girl?" Edwin looked back at him with dull surprise. "I hit my head," she muttered, putting her hand to the sticky place behind and above her ear. She felt something at once soft and stiff amid her tangled hair. She pulled it free from the mat of the blood. It was a feather, black, a cubit long. It had been in her hair the whole time she'd been coming down the mountain, and she had not known. Realization struck her with the coldness of shadow across strong light. She shuddered once, staring at the thing. Her hand snapped open, but the feather did not fall, stuck to the half-dried ooze on her palm. She shook her hand, and still it clung, black and blood-damp. She could not bear to touch it or pull it free with her other hand. The last ray of Solstar winked out, like a candle snuffed. The square was smothered in shadow. All was night. Iriel could still see the vampire's feather dimly, a black streak in the dark against the paleness of her flesh. No one moved towards her. No one stared to help her. She gave a long, low cry of revulsion and despair, and she swooned. So that's the end of chapter 1. I'm sorry if my reading is not the best. I'm trying really hard. This is the first time I've ever tried to read an audiobook, so bear with me. But I hope you're going to really enjoy this story and get into it. That's it. Let's go on to chapter 2.